Behavior Genetics, Part 1, Basic Issues. Personality Psychology, Dr. Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Hi, Dr. B here. This is probably the unit that has changed most since I've been teaching this course. We found out much more about genetics, and the biologists have unraveled DNA. We can now do things like look at our own personal genetic histories. And we can do it relatively inexpensively with a lot of things like programs like 23andMe and other type of programs where you do a simple swab of your mouth and you can get back information about your genetic history, where your origins are, and all that interesting stuff. We couldn't do that when I started teaching this class 30 years ago. I'm sure that by the time I finish recording this lecture, something that I've said will be obsolete. But science advances on. Let's talk about behavior genetics and personality. Well, let's talk about genes and behavior. First thing we need to do is define the human genome. Now, the genome consists of all of the genes an organism possesses. And the human genome in particular contains between 30 and 80,000 genes nested on 23 pairs of chromosomes. This is all stuff you know from basic elementary school science classes, right? Well, let's look at it. Genetics in terms of specific things having to do with behavior. And there is a whole field of study called behavior genetics. Now, the goal of behavior genetics is to determine the percentage of individual differences that can be attributed to genetic differences and the percentage that can be attributed to environmental differences. We call that partialing out the differences. And naturally it always adds up to 100. So something may be 70% environmental, 30% genetic, or just as likely 70% genetic and 30% environment. Behavior geneticists are interested in looking at the ways in that genes and the environment interact to produce behaviors and other individual differences. Now, we get our genes from our parents, and I love this slide because you see dad's got one set of stripes, mom's got another, and the kid's got a checkerboard. So, the goals of genetic research is to look at what environmental effects change an individual in relation to their genes. And these might be things like socialization, different teachers that children have in the same family, things like that. Now, if you get anything from this lecture at all, and I mean anything, maybe even in the whole personality class, I want you to thoroughly understand this next point. And that's that genes interact with the environment to produce behaviors in a probabilistic manner. Just because you have a genetic propensity for something doesn't mean you're going to have that characteristic. You just have a probability that you will. Now, if you look at gene studies of important characteristics like alcoholism. Now, alcoholism is one of the very few monogenetic markers. Most of the characteristics we talk about that have genetic effects are multiply determined by a series of genes working in concert with each other. Very few monogenes. So let's use alcoholism as an example here. If you have the alcoholism gene and you drink, there is a far greater probability you're going to become an alcoholic than someone who does not possess that gene. if you have the alcoholism gene and you don't drink, you're not going to become an alcoholic. On the other hand, you may be lacking, for lack of a better word, the alcoholism gene and just really work hard to become an alcoholic by just over imbibing in alcohol. So you don't need the gene to become an alcoholic. If you do have the gene, you're in far greater danger of alcoholism. Let me give you another example of probabilistic nature of genes. Here's one of my favorite pictures of my son David, who's now a grown man, and my dog Sasha, who was my dog that I had, my first dog that I owned as an adult. I had her through many parts of my life. She got me through grad school. She got me through the early parts of my professorship and through my separation and divorce. So she was always there and always solace for me. But let's talk a little bit about Sasha and what happened to her in her life. And poor Sasha had some very unpleasant things happen to her in her early formative environment. Now, Sasha was literally a rescue dog. My ex and I were visiting friends in Michigan that lived on a man-made lake. And there were no fences around the houses at this lake. So the dogs ran kind of free. They had a little pack. It was very pleasant. But we're visiting them, and our friends say, "Do you want to take this dog home? She's not our dog, and we don't know what's going to happen to her. So please take her home." And it turns out that there were some, guys in their early 20s who were kind of redneck type guys. I know that may show one of my prejudices, but it is. And they were construction guys, and they were pretty irresponsible. But they thought it would be fun to have a puppy, and they were renting the house a couple of doors down from our friends. So they got the puppy, but one of the things they didn't realize is you had to take care of the dog. And they would leave for days at a time and wouldn't feed her, and just generally didn't take care of her. Well, the story as relayed to us by our friends was this. After being gone for several days, the guys came home and they brought carry-out Chinese food with them, set it on the table, and they worked in cable TV construction, putting up the wiring and all that kind of stuff in the early days of cable. And they thought that they were going to go clean up and come and eat their food. Well, the dog had been locked up and not fed for 3 days. And I would imagine you'd do the same thing Sasha did if you hadn't been fed for 3 days. She got up on the table and started eating the food. Well, this infuriated the guys. And like I said, they're big burly guys. One of them picked up the dog. The other held the door open and literally threw poor Sasha out the door, and she ended up being wrapped around a tree with the force of being thrown. They were that angry. Later, we were to find out that most of her ribs on one side were cracked from that incident. So I was always raised with dogs. My ex wasn't, and she was kind of against having a dog, but she kind of softened a bit, and we ended up taking Sasha home. We had Sasha for a couple of weeks, and Sasha was used to having a lot of freedom, and now she was living in suburbia in a small, fenced-in yard. And my ex came home from work, opened the door, the dog darted out. She struggled with her, tried to grab her, she got away. Ran into the street between two parked cars, and some guys were driving down the street and saw her run in front of them, but couldn't stop fast enough. They slammed on the brakes, but she ended up under the front end of their car. Now, you know what happens when a car slams on its brakes. Let me use my little mouse pointer. You know, the front end of a car goes down, kind of like that. And what happened was the front end of the car hit poor Sasha in the head. And my wife got the dog, took her to the vet. The guys were very upset. It wasn't their fault at all. And this was way before the days of cell phones. I came home and found a note on the table saying, dog hit by car at vet. And I thought, well, had a dog for 2 weeks. And I didn't know what vet. I didn't know where. And eventually, my ex came home with the dog, and we took her to the vet several times after that. And she was x-rayed. That's how we found out about the healed broken ribs. But if you look carefully at Sasha's leg, the one that's on the left side, you can tell that it's thinner and she's kind of hanging it a bit. Well, the force of the car hitting her head caused damage, some brain damage, and she lost motor use of her left leg. Now, if resiliency is a trait, Sasha was nothing more than resilient, because within 2 days she was hopping fences again and running around the neighborhood and causing trouble. It took a long time to get that dog settled down. But she'd been abused. She'd been malnourished. And my real question here, and I know I should probably be talking about how wonderful my son is and how cute he is, and yes, he's cute at 3 there. But the behavior genetics question comes, what breed of dog do you think Sasha is? Now, David is 3, not fully grown in that picture. He's got a ways to go. Eventually got over a little over 6 feet. Sasha's fully grown there. She's probably about, at that point, about 6 or 7. So what breed do you think she is? Now, I loved my Michigan vet. He's a great guy. But I think he missed the mark on trying to type her breed. He said she was a Beagle mix. Nowadays, we could have her genetically tested, find out exactly what mix of breed she was. But at the time, that wasn't viable. So she kind of looks like a German Shepherd, but she's also kind of got a broad chest like a Husky. But she's way too small to be either a German Shepherd or a Husky. Some people have guessed Australian Shepherd, some mix like that. But my guess is, had she not been beaten, tortured, malnourished, she would have been a much larger dog. I could tell you dog stories about Sasha for the next 45 minutes or so, but we have to get back to our discussion of behavior genetics. But if you think about things in terms of probabilities, she might have had the probability to be much bigger. Just didn't happen. She was also smart as a whip, and that'll be the last little bit of bragging I do about my dog in this lecture. Let me show you a picture that's far more disturbing. Here are 2 identical twins separated at birth. They don't look anything at all similar, do they? The twin on the left is extremely emaciated, much slighter in figure, and the other twin got a little bit of a tummy and is taller, far more filled out. Well, these were identical twins. They have exactly the same genes, exactly the same DNA. But one was malnourished for years. This brought about changes in his bone structure, and the environmental factors that this poor guy faced led to these dramatic differences in how the genes could express themselves. So genes aren't necessarily destiny. Genes always interact and are intertwining with our environment to give us some kind of result. Let's use this to define some things, like environmentality. Environmentality is the proportion of variance in a group of individuals that are attributed to the environment. So if you have a large number of extremely emaciated, malnourished persons, that's going to be due to something going on in the environment where there's malnutrition. Could be a drought, could be a famine, could be just human nastiness, as opposed to the man on the right who's probably had many opportunities. At least he was extremely well nourished. So heritability, very interesting question. In the second part of our video lecture on behavior genetics, we'll look at some misconceptions about studying genetics and behavior. See you next time. Bye. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.